This is a download from BFM 89.9, the business station.
It's Fun Friday. My name is Jeff Sandhu, and Matt has been watching TV again. And whenever he does that, we get a 25-minute lecture on whatever it is he thinks he's learned this week. Last week, he recommended that we all watch a show about cloning. Guess what this week's episode is about? Could it be cloning?
Well, maybe you've got this all the wrong way round, Jeff. Maybe last week was part of a forward-thinking setup for this week's show. Did you think of that?
Well, I dismissed it as a possibility even before the thought had the time to fully form.
Well, normally you'd be right, but this time you are actually oh so wrong. So today we're talking about Numans, not the Gary Newman fans. Those are actually Numanoids. But coming back to this idea of trans or post-humans that we've covered on the show before. What kicked me off on today's story, and the Paul Rudd show was a happy coincidence along the way, was a story about the debate in neuroscience about research into human brain tissue and the concern that we may be on the verge of crossing some ethical lines that separate, research on pieces of cells or tissues to a larger debate where these lumps of tissue, while they're not fully formed brains, are nevertheless capable of creating spontaneous brainwaves.
Okay, before we get there, is this an attempt to clone humans?
Well, on the face of it, no. I think it's safe to say that most neuroscientists are slightly less preoccupied with the idea of cloning people than the cast of the movie Weird Science. But what we're talking about are very small pieces of brain tissue that are made from stem cells, small as in the size of a pea. Now, experimenting with these tissues, which are called organoids, could allow us much greater understanding of the human brain and consequently how we can treat brain-related diseases and conditions. But the question facing them is where to draw that line. Where does it stop being benign research and cross over into human experimentation?
Another fun topic on a Friday morning. Have you stopped to think that people may not want to think about human experimentation while they're digesting their breakfast?
Well, if you look at it another way, our podcast audience may be listening at precisely the right time to talk about human experimentation.
And what time would that be?
Well, if someone would let me experiment on brain tissue, I could very well tell you down to the actual second. But for some reason, my path lab privileges have been revoked. Some people just aren't very forward-thinking.
So today's argument is that there should be controls in places to stop people like you getting their hands on brain tissue?
Well, I might be arguing for the reverse of that, but it is still part of the same discussion. Right. Often when we talk about this stuff on the show, it does seem esoteric. But as I said before, research has shown the organoids developing spontaneous brainwaves that are similar to something that you might expect to see in premature babies.
And what are the neuroscientists hoping to achieve with this testing?
Well, this is one of those weird ethical dilemmas. We can't really experiment on live human brains. I know, because I've tried. We can observe them, however. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about echolocation and people with visual impairments. And the MRIs showed that the act of clicking stimulated the part of the brain that in normally sighted people helps us to map our space. So, of course, observation is not without enormous benefits.
But there are some things that require approaches that are a little more invasive?
Well, of course, organoids are being used to determine why some babies infected with Zika go on to develop small brains. They've looked at conditions as varied as schizophrenia, Parkinson's disease, and autism. We often forget that the brain is the control center for conditions in other parts of the body, like age-related macular degeneration, which is also something that's being explored with organoids. In fact, a few years ago when I developed some eye problems, I ended up seeing a behavioral optometrist because I needed to retrain the way I was using my eyes and my brain together. So that treatment had an occupational therapy focus because, a little like the visually impaired subjects who were experimenting with echolocation, I was trying to change the way my brain was processing the information around me.
And how far has the research gone?
Well, there are a lot of grey areas with this. There may be research that the neuroscience community isn't aware of, things that we only learn about when the scientists publish or go public, a bit like the Chinese scientist who announced at the end of last year that he'd altered the DNA of a number of fetuses in the womb. Certainly, even in the research that we do know about, there have been astonishing or, depending on your viewpoint, deeply worrying achievements in this area.
But that's quite subjective. What kind of results are we talking about?
Well, a study at Harvard published in 2017 showed that the organoids develop an incredible range of cells. This has been one of the things that has so baffled and intrigued scientists. How do our cells know how to form these complicated structures? Why don't liver cells become a kidney or a pancreas instead? The Harvard team found that the organoids grown for 8 months formed their own neuronal networks, including cerebral cortex neurons and retinal cells, and they actually responded when light was shone on them.
But that's still a long way from sentience, isn't it?
Well, this is why it's complicated. It's that determination of cells to live that's so fantastic. I think we may have mentioned this study on Geeks at some point. A study at San Diego's Salk Institute found that organoids implanted into mouse brains the scientists found that they connected to the blood supply, and those organoids began to form new connections. No one was suggesting we'd have human-brained mice, but it does make you stop and think what those cells are trying, or rather are programmed to do.
And if we're saying that this isn't a direct attempt at cloning us, so what is the main worry?
Well, one worry is that the organoids may develop pain receptors or will develop other measures of sentience that we have to worry about, or, that make us stop and think whether those cells are actually suffering. In a way, it kind of mirrors the research that we're doing with AI and the ethical questions that research is also requiring us to have.
And where is that line currently?
The same place as with AI, it really isn't. We're seeing this enormous legislation gap across the board when it comes to science and technology. And it is an incredibly complex area. It's like these debates we have over abortion or stem cells or embryo research. Where is it that we draw the line? When do those cells become something that is recognizable as something human? It doesn't help, of course, that different countries enforce different limits, so we don't even have that international sense of consensus.
Do we still have time?
Well, that depends how you look at it. The neuroscience community is starting to have these discussions, and the point is not that we're already at that point where a person might find themselves awake and in the body of another creature. As Hank Greeley, director for the Center for Law and Biosciences at Stanford University, points out, this is the Gregor Samsa state, the character in Franz Kafka's novel Metamorphosis, who wakes up to find he's a giant insect. Now, we're not there, but he points out that we may be at the point where organoids are complex enough that these miniature brains can actually perceive or react to stimuli.
And that ability to feel pain.
Well, Greeley doubts we're there yet, but he also points out that we shouldn't wait around for the science to reach those levels before we start to make these decisions about what to do. With any kind of medical research, it comes back to those factors. Is the potential to cause harm and suffering in achieving these breakthroughs and that knowledge, is that actually worth the perceived or future benefits?
And some people will always argue yes.
Yeah, and we've seen throughout history what happens when people think the end justifies the means.
Okay, but how does this all fit in with Paul Rudd?
Well, I'm glad you brought me back round to that. When we've talked about Numans before, whether as post or transhumans, we've always talked about them as being theoretical, still something that's a ways off. But I think along with this research in organoids, the DNA manipulation, whether it's official or as a result of biohacking, we're already at this point where Numans are real. It's not a joke. It's not a theory anymore. It's something we have to confront because we have to decide, do we want this future or not?
Do we?
Well, I don't know. But after the break, we'll do a little recap of some of the things we've talked about before when it comes to this evolutionary jump in our species. And, we're not going to actually answer the question, but I think it's enough if we just get people thinking about it. Do we control the technology? Do we democratize it? Do we commercialize it? Or do we use it to improve the lives of people everywhere, regardless of their income or geography. So yes, when we come back, we'll meet the Numans and discuss the rise of a superspecies.
Oh, you wanted to say the rise of supermen, didn't you?
I did, especially now that the Watchmen TV show has come out, but I'm doing my best to avoid gendered collective terms, even if they do make for punchier slogans.
All right, you may think that Matt's evolving. Well, he isn't. He still puts people into two categories, him and us. And after the break, Matt takes us to meet the Numans. BFM 89.9.
Be free, Malaysians. BFM 89.9, the business station.
And we're back, and in the first part of the show, we looked at the breakthroughs in medical research that allows us to create miniature human brains called organoids. Now, Matt is taking us on a journey into our own future as we meet the Numans. So, Matt, you're really upset about Numanoids, aren't you?
I am a little bit. Numans is good, but Numanoids is a much better word. But, I have too much respect for Gary Numan and his music to try and poach on his territory. So what I really want is for everyone listening to imagine that they hear Numanoid every time that I say Numan.
All right, so who are the Numans?
Well, in a sense, as I said, the Numans already walk among us. There's a small army of people. Sorry, I shouldn't call them an army, probably. There's a large subculture of people who have already hacked their DNA, of course, only in small ways. But these are people who are actively redesigning themselves at a cellular level, whether it's to build muscle mass or to edit out the propensity for certain diseases. We're not going to go into that kind of technical scientific side of it too much today. There's a show on a leading streaming service called Unnatural Selection, which goes into that side of it in detail. Now, I haven't had time to watch it yet, but my wife reliably ensures me that it's more informative than listening to this show. So that's nice.
All right, so we're looking more at what society might look like.
Well, yeah, that's where we loop to that show I mentioned earlier, Living with Yourself. It's a new Paul Rudd show, also on a leading streaming service. So the premise, without giving too much away, is that Paul Rudd inadvertently ends up cloning himself. And of course, this isn't new. This is a sci-fi fiction trope. But a bit like the Arnie movie, The Sixth Day, which if you haven't watched it, that is an absolute and surprisingly chilling sci-fi classic. So if you haven't watched it, watch it this weekend if you've got time. And it sort of quite eerily predicts the rise of drone helicopters as well. But anyway, like that movie, Living with Yourself confronts the reality of finding a way to live in a world with a version of you that is genetically identical, even down to having the same memories.
And figuring out which is the real you.
Well, again, I'm not giving away any spoilers here. In The Sixth Day, Arnie's character is the same. And that enables him to tell some classically cheesy Arnie jokes to himself. Living with Yourself is a little more complex. One of the versions of Paul Rudd is superior to the other. They aren't exactly carbon copies. You'll have to watch the show to figure out which is which. And that's very much the world we're looking at. These Numans being enhanced humans.
And you're not worried about the cloning aspect?
Well, before the break, we were talking about recreating human brains rather than cloning them. They may be created from cloned cells. They have the potential to be the same or very similar to you. But unlike these sci-fi shows, we don't have the ability to recreate or copy the memories, at least yet. So, you have those environmental factors, nature, nurture, whatever. So I think it's probably unlikely that the clone would develop into the same person as you, but it could certainly be close enough in terms of temperament and mannerisms to be extremely annoying, if not downright scary.
And where do you think we'll go if we democratize the technology?
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? DNA hacking is already incredibly cheap. As we've said before, most of the developments we see in biotech are really hard to replicate outside a lab without thousands of or even millions of dollars worth of knowledge and laboratories. Gene editing is not like that. I mean, I'm not going to say exactly how easy it is. A simple Google search will do that for anyone, but it uses cheap and easily available techniques and chemicals, and it is the kind of thing that, at a push, you could do at home.
Isn't that an argument in favor of making it commonly available?
Well, that's the view that the biohackers are taking.
Yeah.
And there is something to that argument. When you look at the control option, it does generally backfire. Look at something as simple as sex selection in babies. Countries like India and China are facing serious population imbalances already for a variety of cultural reasons. Many countries favor male offspring rather than female offspring.
Offspring?
Well, what do you want me to call them? You know, my historical indifference to babies that aren't kittens is well documented on this show. You know, sex selection is something that's at the relatively benign end of DNA modification, but look how damaging even that can be. Do we want a future where everyone designs their babies to look like the Instagram influencer of the day because that's what people think success looks like? Do we want a world full of millions of Kylie Jenners and Matt Armitages representing the pinnacle of our species?
All right, I'm going to control myself and not comment. If it's too dangerous to let us all have access, then why not opt for control?
Because it probably won't work either. As I said, you know, this is very easy to manipulate technology. We've already seen the first essentially black market babies emerge in China. And look at what's happening with something like silicon implant treatment, especially in South America. There are legitimate clinics for the wealthy, some of which are willing to bend the letter of the law. And then there are the backstreet operations using unsafe materials in unsanitary conditions, where you literally have no idea what you're getting. So you have these two tiers of humanity we've talked about before, those who can afford to enhance and those who can't. And that's the point where we stop being part of the same species.
If it was open to all, you could switch off that baldness gene.
That's just mean. And as I am the epitome of human male evolution, that would automatically suggest that baldness is a preferential trait, something that you edit in and not out. And as you said, you know, I do see the world in terms of me and everybody else. So I look at a different set of rules for myself in any case.
All right, cartoon villainy aside, should we view these biohackers as pioneers?
Well, very often when scientists genetically engineer species like they've done with mosquitoes, they're at pains to ensure that what they've done is create a sterile individual. One of the issues with things like genetically modified corn or soy, which incidentally I have no problem with in theory because there isn't anything to suggest they're dangerous. But one of the issues with these GM crops is that they end up airborne. Now, I'm not an expert in plant breeding, but my understanding is that tests from organic and non-GM farms have detected the presence of those GM strains amongst their own crops. And of course, once things are out there, they do what nature has programmed them to do, which is to adapt to their environment. Because, as this episode is really all about, evolution doesn't stay still.
And how does that relate to biohackers?
Because what they're doing to themselves could well be inheritable. Even if those traits aren't, we don't know what the long-term effects of those changes will be. For example, if you switch a gene to increase muscle mass, will that switch stay on? Will you continue to develop the mass beyond the ability of your musculoskeletal structure to actually cope with it? Will you have to tweak other genes to sympathetically support those changes? And will you have to tweak other genes to support those changes as well? You know, it just goes on and on and on. So we're increasingly hearing about advances in treatments that could halt or reverse the aging process. But at what cost? You know, we aren't physically or mentally designed to be immortal. Other than certain fast food snacks, nothing actually is.
And if you're not in favor of democratization or control, what do you want?
I don't know. Possibly the I Am Legend movie with me in the Will Smith role, the only person on Earth with a cat rather than a dog, obviously. But that's generally, or genuinely rather, what's so scary about this. There are no good outcomes. Democratization is going to lead to some crazy results. Control is probably impossible. And that's before we talk about the mechanical and artificial intelligence side of enhancement.
And you really want to go there?
Well, there's really no choice. You know, if we're talking about growing human brains, we're already seeing major tech companies work on brainwave interfaces. We know that biohacking is a reality. Look at Google's new Pixel 4 phone. Its assistant is on the phone, not just in the cloud. So there's your AI on a chip. already in a consumer device.
And you don't think there's anything we can do to stop all this from converging?
I mean, do you?
No.
No, exactly. Is there any way to switch this inevitability off? I don't think so. The reality of this next phase in humanity is here. The question is now, what do we do? How do we cope with it?
And will the Numans be a threat to the old mans?
Well, I imagine so, wouldn't you? I mean, there's not many Neanderthals still knocking around. The problem with supposedly superior races is that they don't have much time for the ones they see as inferior. If we were lucky, I guess interbreeding would see to it that the species combined and that our DNA would make it into the mix.
And what's to stop someone from tweaking a gene to stop Numans being able to breed us with sapiens?
Well, that really is the big question. What is to stop someone from doing that and making sure Numans could only breed with other Numans? Normally we end with me saying, it's a big leap from these ideas to where the technology is today. But this is where the technology is today. And it's progressing at an astonishing rate. We're all afraid of degenerating into this zombie apocalypse. But what if the survivors in those shows are really Numans? And what seem like mindless zombies to them are really just ordinary people like us. Of course, I don't think that's going to be our future, but the world of the Numan is already here, and not just of the Friends Electric variety.
I know we just celebrated Halloween, but my God, that was a scary episode. Also, for you to put Kylie Jenner and Matt Armitage in the same sentence, I don't know.
I didn't say we were going to breed. I just said people would design their children to look like us as the perfection, the epitome of society. We talked about perfection last week. That's what perfection looks like.
And if you missed any parts of the show, you can download the podcast now, available on the BFM website or the BFM app. Stay tuned. We'll have Geek Squawks after this, BFM 89.9.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To find more great interviews, go to bfm.my or find us on iTunes. BFM 89.9, the business station.